Thank you. Thank you very much. I really appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy schedules to attend this evening. I was just commenting to a friend yesterday that in light of the subject matter, I wasn't sure if anyone was going to show up. So I'm happy to note that in a lecture hall that holds 97 people, we are close to capacity. Tonight's presentation is called The Gig is Up: Money, the Federal Reserve, and You. Its purpose is to serve as an efficient and factually based primer on money, its contemporary creation, and how it's being used against us. In the second half of the talk, after an historical analysis of our monetary policy in the United States, I will offer some thoughts and suggest some constitutionally sound alternatives. Why is this issue important? Well, because if we in the general public do not come to understand the nature of our money and some of the terms and concepts that we're going to be going over tonight, then we will soon be at risk of losing our quality of life. And not just what we've become accustomed to, but that which we truly and dearly cherish. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in a battle, and that battle has been raging for centuries. It's a battle for freedom, which the general public is losing, quite frankly, because we've lost contact with our history. The good news, however, is that it's a positive fight for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. At the core of this conflict is money, its creation, and its use in the control of us. Before I begin, let me stress that this lecture is a synthesis of information researched by others. Accordingly, throughout the talk, I will name drop and cite certain sources. This will serve to reference the material, but most importantly, credit those upon whose shoulders I stand. Although those well-informed may find this discussion rather elementary, the ultimate goal is to raise the population's basic level of consciousness with regard to this subject. To do that, we will start simple and work our way up. To begin, we must ask, what is money? What is this substance we spend most of our lives chasing, upon which the majority of us base our decisions on education, employment, and unfortunately, personal relationships? Certainly, I'm not here to suggest that we should or should not place such an importance on money, but simply to remark that if we're going to spend so much of ourselves gaining this thing, we ought to at least know what it is, particularly since our money in this country is exactly the opposite of what we are led to believe it is. Now, most of us start learning about money when we're children. We play with it. We enjoyed games of Monopoly and Life. We heard our parents fight about it. We watched game shows about money. We saved it. We went to school. We got a job. We got paid. We bought a car. We bought a house. But I'm afraid that we have been, at the very least, misled. And to understand the full extent of the deception, and that's what it is, we must learn some very basic terms and concepts. The dictionary defines money as coin, portable pieces of stamped metal in use as a medium of exchange, coin and banknotes, specific sums of currency, an amount of money, wealth. That's how we generally understand money, as a medium of exchange. The fisherman doesn't take 4,000 fish and trade it for a new boat. He takes the fish, sells it, obtains money, pays his workers with it, and then buys the new boat. Now that's a simple explanation, but it helps explain the mystical element of money. Money represents all material things, everything and anything. But for our purposes tonight, we have to go a little deeper into the theory of money to really determine what money is, or at least should be. To do that, I'll utilize an old pun and rhyme teaching tool found in economics textbooks. Money is a matter of functions for medium, measure, standard, and store. Now I realize this is the part where everyone's eyes start to sort of roll back in their head, because this stuff is confusing and technical, and that's certainly part of the mystery of money. But you know this. Money as a medium of exchange. We've gone over that. Secondly, in money, there must be a measure or unit. In math, the unit is number 1. In money, our unit is a dollar. That's simple enough. But that dollar must have some standard of value acceptable to pay a debt. For example, you've heard of the gold standard, which values a dollar on the value of gold at a certain price. And lastly, money must be able to be stored. Stuck in a pillowcase, locked in a safe, put in an investment account, kept for later. It is with this general understanding of money that we can move to the different forms of money we use to represent money, which throughout time has been anything from feathers, shiny stones, buckskins, shells, minted metals, to marks on a tally stick. For an in-depth recounting of the historical development of money, there's a wonderful documentary called The Money Masters. But for time's sake, I want to stay focused on our contemporary system in which we use coin, currency, and credit. These are forms of money that we use in our day-to-day lives. Most of us right now could pull out of our pocket a credit card or a coin or cash. That's our money. Now, with regard to credit, almost the entire focus of the presentation is about credit in a monetary system. But since credit is extended from coin and currency, two concepts must be understood before we go further. Money in form can either be intrinsic money or fiat money. Intrinsic money is money that in and of itself has value. Obviously, gold or silver coins, and sure, the gold coin might say a $5 coin that you can pay a debt. It's standardized, but the coin itself has value. You might trade not only for a good because it's $5, but because the coin itself can be used and stored. It has value everywhere. With regard to currency, the purists say paper money never has intrinsic value. But I disagree. If a certificate or dollar can be turned in for gold or silver or something intrinsic, at least the paper represents intrinsic money and is much more convenient to carry and store. Fiat money is money backed by agreement or power. Black's Law Dictionary defines the Latin word fiat as let it be done. You might have seen that in a movie stated by Caesar. That means by decree. When the magistrate issues an order, that's by decree. So that makes sense in terms of our money. When a government or a bank or a king says, this is your money, you say, okay. Now, whether it's worth anything or it's trusted is a matter of agreement and or power. Suffice to say that fiat money has no value in and of itself. Some economists say that fiat money is not money because you can't store it. It's either made out of paper or tin or nickel. So as long as we understand the difference between these two types of money, then I think we'll be okay. Now, we have fiat currency and coin in this country. Our currency is created and printed by a private central bank called the Federal Reserve, about which we will go into detail here in a minute. Our coins are minted by the federal government, but are primarily used for change. Credit from our fiat money is extended by banks. But what most people don't realize is that credit in our system lawfully becomes money. Normally, we think of credit as an extension of trust to pay later. But credit in a monetary system means a loan of money which by its very nature is a debt to the borrower. However, when a loan is created by a bank, it doesn't loan currency or coin. The borrower's promise to pay back the loan becomes an asset upon which the loan is made. Because the loan is based on credit to the individual borrower, it's paid out in credit. For example, when you're at the closing table ready to buy a house and the seller is on the other side waiting for a check for $400,000, the check is not slid across the table until you sign the promissory note. Your signature creates the credit necessary to make the check good, and an account is established for you to pay it back. The bank doesn't really loan out its money to you for payment to the seller. It creates the money. Now, the seller could take the check to the bank and cash it, but the bankers know that no one's going to do that. If someone does, banks have the reserves to cash the check. But the overwhelming number of people are going to put that check in a bank account and be given credit for the face amount of the check. That credit then becomes money, which becomes an asset to the bank upon which it can make more loans. That is, issue more credit. Better said, issue more money. So if we know behind every credit is a debt, and if in our society credit is money, that means that debt equals money. That's called fractional reserve banking, and it's a term that you must become familiar with. Now, I know it's somewhat confusing, that's understandable. For a simple and animated documentary of this topic, Paul Grignon's Money as Debt is a great start. Now, the currency that we're talking about, which serves as the backup or reserve in case someone wants to cash out, that too is created by debt. Let me explain. We have what's called a central banking system. One private bank with branches across the country, authorized and chartered by Congress as the Federal Reserve System, which prints our money, regulates the regular banks and financial institutions, sets interest rates and monetary policy. Think of it as the privatization of the government's job to control the money supply. The thought being, who knows more about banking than bankers? Leaving the control of money to the whims of the populace or the fickle nature of politicians is simply too risky, they say. Plus, this monetary stuff is technical and better left to business minds than that of the bureaucrat. So, when the government wants or needs money for anything it so desires, it asks the Federal Reserve to print it up. And since it's fiat, no gold or silver is necessary, the Federal Reserve prints it up. But the Federal Reserve is not a nonprofit organization. It was chartered by, and its shareholders are, the richest people in the world. And no bank just prints and gives away money. No, it's loaned to the government at interest. A fascinating documentary entitled Zeitgeist Addendum graphically explains the process by which the government puts up bonds which are honored by the Federal Reserve as a promise to repay, and the Federal Reserve prints the currency out of thin air. It looks cool. It's very hard to counterfeit. It's well designed, and it is the world reserve currency by agreement and power. But even with that, not all of the Federal Reserve currency is actually printed. Most money created by the Federal Reserve is digital. In fact, only 3% of our total money supply is actually printed currency and minted coin. The rest of the money is a marker on a ledger, bits on a hard drive. There's no other way to put it. The bigger issue, however, is over and above this currency, well over 90% of our total money in supply is the money created by banks through fractional reserve banking. So, we have, by the safest estimates, about $10 trillion in our total money supply. Approximately 10% of that is currency created by the Federal Reserve, digitally or materially. 3% of our total money supply is actually printed currency. Now, where's your 401k? Where's your bank account? Well, it's in there somewhere, and theoretically, 10% of it is actual currency The rest is created by the banks as an extension of credit. It doesn't exist. It's bits on a computer. It's ones and zeros. Now, hear this. This money, created by the Federal Reserve out of thin air, which stands as the real currency, backed by nothing other than the government's promise to pay it back, is paid back by the sweat of your brow in the form of personal income tax. What a system. And it does work. Who knows more about banking than bankers, right? We're just the dummies down here taking out and paying back the loans to the bank with after-tax dollars. Except that there's one problem. All of this money is running at interest. And we know when we take out a mortgage or a car loan or we pay back our student loans, we practically always pay more interest in the end than the principal, normally more than double. But interest isn't an asset and doesn't become money. So what we have money as debt here, money as debt here, and over and above that, just debt. Debt. Interest on all of this credit. So everyone chases around this money to pay the principal and all of the other debt associated with the interest and late fees. Even more astonishing, payments toward the principal of the debt get removed from the money supply, essentially removed from the ledger. Payment on the interest goes to bankers. So in order to keep the money supply going, to chase this ever-increasing debt, more and more debt has to be created. Otherwise, things go bad. I think they call that a business cycle. That is when people and businesses stop taking loans because of either high interest rates or other economic factors. Money is thus not being adequately replaced in the system. Business slows. Some of the debts go bad. The money supply gets restricted and more debts go bad. Conservatives start pulling out their money. That's called a bank run, and that's the banker's worst nightmare. Because obviously there's not nearly enough money to pay for all the money we think we have. In 1935, Robert Hemphill, the former credit manager of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, said under oath in a Senate hearing, if all the bank loans were paid, no one could have a bank deposit, and there would not be a dollar of coin or currency in circulation. This is a staggering thought. We are completely dependent on the commercial banks. Someone has to borrow every dollar we have in circulation, cash or credit. If the banks create ample synthetic money, we're prosperous. If not, we starve. We are absolutely without a permanent money system. When one gets a complete grasp of the picture, the tragic absurdity of our hopeless position is almost incredible. But there it is. It is the most important subject intelligent persons can investigate and reflect upon. It's so important that our present civilization may collapse unless it becomes widely understood and the defects remedied very soon. And ladies and gentlemen, they have not been remedied. Far from it. And as a student of history, government, and law, I can assure you that this is not a capitalist free market system. This is called debt slavery, pure and simple. It's a Ponzi scheme, and we are this close to losing our country. This close. There's a battle going on, ladies and gentlemen, and it's been raging for centuries. Now, I know this is a lot of information. Accordingly, I'd like to take about a 10-minute break to digest this information and sort of refresh ourselves. When we return, I'll go through a quick historical examination of the creation of our central banking system in the United States and finish with some commentary. Thank you. All the perplexities, confusion, and distresses in America arise not from defects in the Constitution or Confederation, nor from want of honor or virtue, as much from downright ignorance of the nature of coin, credit, and circulation. John Adams. History records that the money changers have used every form of abuse, intrigue, deceit, and violent means possible to maintain their control over governments by controlling money and its issuance. James Madison. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen, and thanks for returning. I realize that this stuff is a little mind-boggling. So, part two. To really understand this topic of money at some core level, the importance of which I hope I don't have to repeat, one has to go back in history to dig out some of the details left out of our textbooks. Our story begins in 1688, 100 years before the Constitution, when essentially the Dutch invaded England, and led by William the Orange, and with the help of British Parliament, the last of the Stuart kings were removed, and William and Mary became the King and Queen of England, Ireland, and Scotland. Now, King Billy, as the Irish used to call him, was born in The Hague and knew the power a central bank could provide a monarchy. The Dutch had greatly expanded their empire throughout the 17th century through the use of a central bank. So, in 1695, the king chartered the Bank of England. This is the charter. If the Constitution is Superman, this is kryptonite. This allowed the bank to monopolize the creation of money in the British Empire, lest you be hanged for counterfeiting. Taxes levied were paid by the king's money, and although it was intrinsic in nature, meaning that it was backed by gold, due to the bank's legal right to engage in fractional reserve banking, it was plentiful. As a consequence, the empire thrived. And we were a part of it. As a British colony, we provided raw materials to the motherland, purchased their fine goods, substantially participated in the trafficking and enslavement of human beings from Africa, and when necessary, as was the case in the French and Indian War, fought side by side with our English brothers and sisters. But, as was always the case, the American colonists seemed to have an independent spirit. Not only were we an ocean away from the kingdom, just to come here and survive said something about the person. Our economic freedom, on the other hand, was tied to England. At that time, we had no silver or gold mines. Most of our money went back to England because of a trade deficit. And the whole point of empire was to control the colonies. In response to this, the governors of the colonies began to print a medium of exchange called colonial script. This was fiat money, bills of credit issued on the credit of the government, and with the release of purchasing power, great prosperity came to the colonies. This competition, which central banks detest, prompted England to impose the Currency Act of 1764. 1 year after the end of the French-Indian War. This outlawed the governors from printing the script. Seems the king was in debt to the bank after the war, and there were those in England who wanted the colonists to pay their share. A year later, the infamous Stamp Act of 1765 was passed, and the American Revolution was born. The refusal of King George III to allow the colonies to operate an honest money system, which freed the ordinary man from the clutches of the money manipulators, was probably the prime cause of the Revolution. Benjamin Franklin. After our Declaration of Independence, however, you can imagine the state of our economy. Although it's unclear how continentals were authorized, these fiat dollars made of paper and tin were used and accepted throughout the Revolutionary War period. They later became as worthless as a continental as our new country labored under the first Articles of Confederation. Ultimately, in 1787, the supreme law of the land was drafted by our founding fathers, penned beautifully as the Constitution of the United States of America by James Madison. With regard to money, Article 1, Section 8 states, "The Congress shall have the power to coin money, regulate the value thereof and of foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures." For most, this authorized only Congress to create money. But our first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, didn't see it that way. He had been arguing throughout that the U.S. needed a strong central bank, like the Bank of England. Thomas Jefferson thought Hamilton was crazy, wondering why we had fought the war in the first place. But Hamilton didn't see it that way. The Constitution didn't say anything about printing money, and he thought the article was an implied power, not an exclusive, expressed one. And of course, he got his way with the creation of the first Bank of the United States in 1791.
I must admit, Mr. Hamilton, I'm a little uncertain as to the purpose of the Treasury Department. No doubt its function will reveal itself to me in good time.
The future prosperity of this nation rests chiefly in trade. Trade depends, among other things, on the willingness of other nations to lend us money.
And how would you propose to establish international credit?
Our first step would be to incur a national debt. The greater the debt, the greater the credit. And to that end, I have recommended to the President that Congress adopt all the debts incurred by the individual states during the war through a national bank. The idea being that if the states owe Congress money, then other nations will feel more inclined to lend it to us.
If the states are indebted to a central authority, it increases the power of the central government.
There you have it exactly. The greater the government's responsibility, the greater its authority.
The moneyed interest in this country is all in the north, so the wealth and power would inevitably be concentrated there in the federal government, to the expense of the south.
If that is the case, it is unavoidable if the Union is to be preserved.
I fear our revolution will have been in vain if a Virginia farmer is to be held in hock to a New York stock jobber, who in turn is in hock to a London banker. The opportunities for avarice and corruption would certainly prove irresistible.
And yes, he nationalized and paid the debt of the states, amortized it, got the government on a payment plan at interest to pay back the bank, and called it an asset, and loaned and created more money based off of it. He was the founding father of fractional reserve banking in America. This is what Jefferson said.
If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered.
Well, the bank worked well enough. It got our government in debt and caused great inflation. But between Jefferson and Madison, our third and fourth presidents respectively, the bank charter was allowed to expire in 1811, after which it was discovered that many of the shareholders were Dutch and English. Unfortunately, less than 1 year after the expiration of the charter, the United States, under President James Madison, somehow found herself back in war with Britain on our soil in the War of 1812, during which the British occupied our capital and tried to burn the White House to the ground. Later, we rallied and the war was called a draw, but it was this war that exposed the shortcoming of a small, intrinsic-based monetary system. Just as Hamilton had argued, central banking provided a liquidity of money to meet a national emergency and to do things like go to war. And as we shall see, nothing drives central banking like war. This prompted even Madison to change his mind and support the Second Bank of the United States, which was rechartered in 1816. After that, the Second Bank of the United States, unquestionably owned in part by rich international bankers, reigned supreme for 12 years until a true maverick from Tennessee, Andrew Jackson, was elected president in 1828. Jackson, more than any other president, hated the manipulative practices of the big central bankers. In 1832, Jackson vetoed an attempt to extend the bank's charter, stating,
"The bold effort the present central bank has made to control the government are but premonitions of the fate that await the American people, should they be deluded into a perpetuation of this institution or the establishment of another like it."
The bank's charter was due to expire in 1836. However, after Jackson was reelected in 1832, he ordered the Treasury to start removing the government's deposit from the bank. In response, the bank's head, Nicholas Biddle, stated,
"Nothing but widespread suffering will produce any effect on Congress. Our only safety is in pursuing a steady course of firm restriction, and I have no doubt that such a course will lead to a restoration of the currency and the recharter of the bank."
Researcher Bill Still called this a stunning revelation, the pure truth, as Biddle clearly warned that he was going to use the money retraction powers of the bank to cause a depression until America gave in. And he did. But Jackson didn't fold, and despite a massive depression blamed on Jackson, the country didn't fall for it, and the bank's charter was not renewed. In 1835, Jackson paid off the national debt and later declared on his tombstone, "I killed the bank." Thereafter, the state's chartered banks reappeared, warts and all, as the practice of fractional reserve banking continued. Here's a note from a now defunct bank back in 1840. You can see they made denominations of $3, $2, and $1. Back then, the states would charter a bank, and then the bank would actually issue the currency. And as you can see, this is from the state of Delaware. In light of the state's ability to essentially print their own money, the country thrived. However, the central banks of England and Europe were not done in their efforts to control the ever-growing and thus threatening economy of the United States. And so they empowered the oldest trick in the book: divide and conquer.
The division of the United States into federations of equal force was decided long before the Civil War by the financial powers of Europe. These bankers were afraid that the United States, if they remain in one bloc as one nation, would attain economic and financial independence which would upset their financial domination over the world. The voice of the Rothschilds prevailed. Therefore, they sent their emissaries into the field to exploit the question of slavery, to open an abyss between the two sections of the Union. Otto von Bismarck, Minister-President of the Kingdom of Prussia, 1862 to 1890, Chancellor of Germany, 1871 to 1890.
Certainly slavery and other issues all contributed to cause the Civil War, but one thing is for certain: the big banks were there to finance both sides of the darkest part of our history, and the battle raged. President Lincoln, understanding exactly what was going on, refused to finance his quest for union after the big banks of New York informed him of their desire to charge as much as 36% on the money he needed. Instead, Lincoln chose to essentially print his own money in the form of greenbacks, purely fiat, to finance the war and pay his soldiers. His plan worked, and although the bills were inflationary, they served as an adequate medium of exchange during the war, and although the greenbacks were discontinued after his assassination, many of the notes printed remained in circulation for another 130 years. Further details on the role international bankers played in our bloody war can be found in Jim Marr's Rule by Secrecy. Suffice to say, Lincoln learned firsthand about the importance of the government's control of the money supply.
The government should create, issue, and circulate all the currency and credit needed to satisfy the spending power of the government and the buying power of consumers. The privilege of creating and issuing money is not only the supreme prerogative of government, but it is the government's greatest creative opportunity. By the adoption of these principles, the taxpayers will be saved immense sums of interest. Money will cease to be master and will then become servant of humanity. Abraham Lincoln.
The irony of the situation, however, was that in conjunction with Lincoln's desire to print his own money, the Congress passed the National Bank Act, and through a tax on state bank notes, forced all non-federal money out of circulation. This essentially happened because during the war, the South did not participate in Congress, thus allowing the Northern industrialists to push the legislation through. After the war and Lincoln's death, the money supply was severely restricted at the behest of the big banks from the East. Not only were many of Lincoln's greenbacks removed from circulation, among other things, silver was demonetized in 1873, that is, removed as a standard to back currency. Although silver was brought back soon thereafter in limited minted coins, to not allow silver to back currency was treasonous to most. Gold was limited and could be cornered. Silver, particularly here in Colorado, was plentiful and truly served as the people's money. Without money, the country severely labored, and the Industrial Revolution was driven as many men, women, and children were forced to work in dangerous conditions for a substandard wage just to keep a roof over their heads and food in their stomachs. In fact, from 1866 to 1886, our total money supply went from $1.8 billion to $400 million. From there, just as Jefferson had warned, the big banks of New York, London, Paris, and Amsterdam manipulated a series of booms and busts, culminating with the Panic of 1907. It was during this time that President Theodore Roosevelt said,
Issue of currency should be lodged with the government and be protected from domination by Wall Street. We are opposed to provisions which would place our currency and credit system in private hands.
In 1908, 100 years ago, populist candidate William Jennings Bryan was chosen in Denver, Colorado as the Democratic Party nominee for President of the United States. Since 1896, Bryan had advocated strongly for a return to a joint silver and gold standard. Frank Baum's The Wizard of Oz portrayed Bryant as Dorothy with silver slippers dancing on the yellow gold brick road. Dorothy killed the Wicked Witch of the East, and the common sense farmer thought to be stupid, the abused industrial worker considered to be heartless, and with, of course, the spineless king of the jungle politician, the group found their way to the Emerald City to confront the Great Oz to argue their case.
You are really great and powerful. You keep your promises.
Do you presume to criticize the Great Oz? You ungrateful creatures think yourselves lucky that I'm giving you audience tomorrow instead of 20 years from now. Oh, the Great Oz has spoken. Oh, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain.
Bryan was defeated, however, in his third attempt at the presidency, after which in 1910, an informal organization of bankers and industrialists led by J.P. Morgan met at his property on Jekyll Island to plot the return of the central bank.
And don't tell me you don't know who J.P. Morgan is.
Using the 1907 panic as grounds for reformation, the big bankers, through legislation they wrote but publicly opposed to mislead the public, assumed power again through the passage of the Federal Reserve Act of 1913. A fascinating book entitled The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin details the whole affair as orchestrated by Morgan and the leaders of finance and capital. Newly elected President Woodrow Wilson signed the bill into law on December 23, 1913, and the rest is history.
This Federal Reserve Act establishes the most gigantic trust on earth. When President Wilson signs this bill, the invisible government of the monetary power will be legalized. The worst legislative crime of the ages is being perpetrated by this banking and currency bill. Representative Charles A. Lindbergh, Sr., Congressman, 1907 to 1917.
Later, after 2 terms, President Woodrow Wilson wrote,
I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government by free opinion, no longer a government by conviction and the vote of the majority, but a government by the opinion and duress of a small group of dominant men.
By 1916, we, for the first time in this country's history, became involved in yet another European war, the cause of which our teachers can't even explain to us. After the war, liquidity was pumped into the markets and the 20s roared. Then, after the money trust had withdrawn their fortunes from the market, the spigot of finance was essentially cut off, and our country died on the vine, and a Great Depression ensued. In 1933, FDR signed an executive order taking the dollar off the gold standard entirely, and in fact issued an order requiring everyone in America to turn in their gold under threat of prison. This is a pre-1933 $10 bill, which, as you can see, is redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury or in gold or lawful money at any Federal Reserve Bank. Additionally, for those interested in researching the role the European central banks played in the destruction of Germany after World War I and the installation of Adolf Hitler, there is a must-see documentary by Lyndon LaRouche entitled Firewall, which also covers many of the topics discussed today. Further research on that issue might also surprise some of you as to the full extent of certain Americans' involvement in the financing of Hitler as well. Throughout much of this difficult time in our history, the chairman of the U.S. House Banking Currency Commission for 22 years, Louis McFadden, said these words among many others.
The Federal Reserve Banks are one of the most corrupt institutions the world has ever seen. There is not a man within the sound of my voice who does not know that this nation is run by the international bankers.
Representative McFadden fought the Federal Reserve from its conception and served to protect the record on the influence of the big banks. And although he made great attempts to reform the Federal Reserve, he was poisoned and died in 1936. To this day, the Federal Reserve has never been audited. Its shareholders have never been disclosed, although with certainty the bank is owned by the Rothschilds, the Rockefellers, Warburgs, and the like. And most incredibly, the Federal Reserve has never paid one dime in taxes despite making billions from the American people. At around the time of McFadden, Henry Ford remarked,
"It is well enough that the people of the nation do not understand our banking and monetary system, for if they did, I believe there would be a revolution before tomorrow morning."
Eventually, the Depression ended after the attack on Pearl Harbor required the United States to again enter into a world war. Because of that, the economy again boomed as our country's transition to empire building through war had begun. Almost 15 years after the war had ended, Supreme Allied Commander of World War II, Dwight D. Eisenhower, during his last days in office as President of the United States, told the nation,
"My fellow Americans, this evening I come to you with a message of leave-taking and farewell, and to share a few final thoughts with you, my countrymen. We have been compelled to create a permanent armaments industry of vast proportions. 3.5 million men and women are directly engaged in the defense establishment. The total influence, economic, political, even spiritual, is felt in every city, every state house, every office of the federal government. We recognize the imperative need for this development. Yet we must not fail to comprehend its grave implications. In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
Following Eisenhower, President John F. Kennedy recognized a problem of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, and he did something about it. On June 4, 1963, President John F. Kennedy issued Executive Order 11110 to abolish the Federal Reserve. In fact, Kennedy also ordered that the United States begin using its silver reserves to back a new currency to be circulated, and it was. Unfortunately, exactly 50 years to the day after the legislation to establish the Federal Reserve was introduced in Congress, President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963. Once President Lyndon Johnson was sworn in, the United States notes were taken out of circulation and legislation was introduced to remove the silver from even the coinage minted by the government. In 1971, President Richard Nixon removed the last vestige of gold as a standard of our currency, which was still being pegged to gold at $35 an ounce. Internationally, currencies were then exchanged at a fixed rate based on our dollar. This interfered, however, with the Federal Reserve's desire to manipulate interest rates in times of needs, and the system which had stood since World War II was abandoned, and our dollar became what's called a floating currency. The international banking cartel had pulled off the impossible, as now all the world's currencies were totally fiat in nature, by decree, straight out of thin air, backed by agreement and power. This, of course, caused massive inflation, and by 1979, to combat the problem, interest rates, as set by then Federal Reserve Chairman Paul Volcker, rose to 20%, and again, the country sank into a significant recession. By that time, despite Watergate, the neoconservative movement was afoot, and with the election of President Ronald Reagan, the most incredible spending spree in the history of man began to, beyond question, gain control of the world. With regard to the dollar, I personally remember Ronald Reagan campaigning on a balanced budget and the return of a gold standard. But after he was shot in 1981, I didn't hear him talk about that much anymore. In fact, what I saw in my time as a student in government at the University of Texas was President Reagan spin us into oblivion fighting the Cold War, putting the Soviets out of business. And this certainly helped our economy, but since it was, again, based on fake and inflated money, much of which was being created by the junk bonds of Michael Milken, the stock market crashed in 1987, the biggest one-day percentage decline in the history of the market. Paul Volcker had just become the chairman of J. Rothschild, Wolfenschon and Company 3 months before the crash, leaving the newly appointed chairman, Alan Greenspan, to handle the problem. At that time, our country was bankrupt, and to that there is no argument. But instead of reorganization, instead of returning to sound money, which he had written about in 1966, particularly in light of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, Chairman Greenspan chose to one-up the problem, double down, and spend our way out of this recession, thereby creating more money. But Greenspan had a problem, and it was a major one. If he was going to pump liquidity into the market by keeping rates low, how was he then going to control inflation with all that money circulating? The only way was to keep the prices of consumer goods low so that the inflation index was kept in check. In order to do that, big business was given a tax break to ship its jobs overseas, essentially spreading the inflation thin worldwide. This reduced labor costs, kept consumer prices artificially low, and deposited our dollars all over the world. This was fed to us as globalization. But for those in the know, it's called imperialization. This had the effect of reducing our economy to a service-based one in which most people were convinced that they simply couldn't live without borrowing, and thus began the age of the credit card, spurred on by a technological boom which in and of itself would have gotten us out of the problem. New industries have a way of doing that. But instead, we used the promise of our new technology to springboard an even bigger bubble. This is a clip from a 60 Minutes piece ran in 1995.
What are derivatives? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. For now, let's just say that they're highly exotic, little understood, and virtually unregulated securities that now make up, according to the Wall Street Journal, a $35 trillion worldwide market. And some people believe they're so unpredictable they could bring down the world banking system. Got your attention? Good, because if you've got a mutual fund or a pension program, you probably own derivatives and don't even know it.
There is a derivative sold by Bankers Trust that is based upon the difference between the Japanese yen and the Thai baht.
And there's another one that we've heard about, let me tell you. A derivative that links 10.8% of the sum of the German mark, Swedish krona, and Italian lira swap rate, plus the Swiss franc and the German pound value, is determined by the London interbank offered rate divided by 5.
I think you missed the square root of the... That, I guess, is not the most exotic specimen available, although it certainly is one of them.
We'd like to show you one, but there's nothing here to put in your safe deposit box. They exist for the most part only on computer screens or as 1 or 2 indecipherable lines on your monthly financial statement.
As economist John Hoefel has noted, During the tech boom of the 1990s, people were literally using credit cards to buy stocks. And that bubble burst hard in 2000. And new ways, again, had to be invented to prop up the system. The answer? Deregulation. Here are some clips that ran just 3 weeks ago.
Can you explain to me what a derivative is?
Yes, a derivative is a financial instrument whose value is based on something else. It's basically a side bet.
Think of it for a moment as a football game. Every week, the New York Giants take the field with hopes of getting back to the Super Bowl. If they do, they'll get more money and glory for the team and its owners. They have a direct investment in the game. But the people in the stands may also have a financial stake in the outcome in the form of a bet with a friend or a bookie.
We could call that a derivative. It's a side bet. We don't own the teams, but we have a bet based on the outcome. And that a lot of derivatives are bets based on the outcome of games of a sort. Not football games, but games in the markets.
Whether interest rates are going to go up or down?
Yes, and the new bet that arose over the last several years is a bet based on whether people will default on their mortgages.
If I thought certain mortgage securities were going to fail,
yes,
I could go out and buy insurance on them without actually owning them?
Yeah, the irony is, though, you're not really buying insurance at that point. You're just placing a bet.
Eric Dinello is the insurance superintendent for the state of New York. He says that credit default swaps were totally unregulated and that the big banks and investment houses that sold them didn't have to set aside any money to cover their potential losses and pay off their bets.
As the market began to seize up and as the market for the underlying obligations began to perform poorly, everybody wanted to get paid, had a right to get paid on those credit default swaps. And there was no there. There was no money behind the commitments, and people came up short. And so that's to a large extent what happened to Bear Stearns, Lehman Brothers, and the holding company of AIG.
In other words, three of the nation's largest financial institutions had made more bad bets than they could afford to pay off. Bear Stearns was sold to J.P. Morgan for pennies on the dollar, Lehman Brothers was allowed to go belly up, and AIG, considered too big to let fail, is on life support thanks to a $123 billion investment by U.S. taxpayers. It's legalized gambling.
It's legalized gambling. It was illegal gambling, and we made it legal gambling. And
with no regulatory controls.
With absolutely no regulatory controls. Zero, as far as I can tell.
I mean, it sounds a little like a bookie operation.
Yes, and it used to be illegal. It was very illegal 100 years ago.
In the early part of the 20th century, the streets of New York and other large cities were lined with gaming establishments called bucket shops, where people could place wagers on whether the price of stocks would go up or down without actually buying them. This unfettered speculation contributed to the panic and stock market crash of 1907, and state laws all over the country were enacted to ban them.
Big headlines, huge type, the front page of the New York Times.
No bucket shops for new law to hit.
So they'd already closed up because the law was coming. Here's a picture of one of them, and they were like parlors. See?
Betting parlors.
Oh, betting parlors. Yeah. It was a felony. Well, it was a felony when the law came into effect because it had brought down the market in 1907. And they said, we're not going to let this happen again. And then 100 years later, in 2000, we rolled them all back.
A bill to reauthorize and amend the Commodity Exchange Act.
The vehicle for doing this was an obscure but critical piece of federal legislation called the Commodity Futures Modernization Act of 2000. And the bill was a big favorite of the financial industry it would eventually help destroy. It not only removed derivatives and credit default swaps from the purview of federal oversight, on page 262 of the legislation, Congress preempted the states from enforcing existing gambling and bucket shop laws against Wall Street. That makes it sound like they knew it was illegal.
I would agree. They did know it was illegal, or they knew it was prosecutable.
In retrospect, giving Wall Street immunity from state gambling laws and legalizing activity that had been banned for most of the 20th century should have given lawmakers pause. But on the last day and the last vote of the lame duck 106th Congress, Wall Street got what it wanted. The Senate passed the bill unanimously.
The Senate stands adjourned. Sine die.
Jim Grant is the publisher of Grant's Interest Rate Observer and one of the country's foremost experts on credit markets.
If you can, and you could, lay down cents on the dollar to place a bet on the solvency of Wall Street, for example, as some did. When Wall Street became evidently insolvent, that cents on the dollar bet went up 30, 40, and 50-fold. Not everyone who did that wants to get his name in the paper, but there are some spectacularly rich people who came out of this. And
who got richer.
Who got richer, became fantastically richer.
A lot of them were hedge fund managers. John Paulson's Credit Opportunities Fund returned almost 600% last year, with Paulson pocketing a reported $3.7 billion. Bill Ackman of Pershing Square Capital Management said he plans to make hundreds of millions. Both declined our request for an interview.
It is a betting game, folks. It's a betting game.
Congress now seems shocked and outraged by the consequences of its decision 8 years ago to effectively deregulate swaps and derivatives.
This is casino capitalism. That's what it is. It's casino capitalism.
And various members of the House and Senate have hauled in the usual suspects to accept or share the blame.
Well, you're wrong. Credit default swaps, I think, have serious problems associated with them.
I sure wish 60 Minutes would have ran a piece or two between 1995 and 2008. But here we are. And the derivatives bubble, the debt created by the bets, which in and of themselves could be hedged, is in the quadrillions. And all of the people that have those bets want to get paid. So if that's our printed currency, and this is at least currency authorized digitally by the Federal Reserve, and this is the mystical money that the banks make on fractional reserve banking, and this is the interest on all of that debt circulating, this is the derivatives. Those people want to get paid. They got their hand out. That's why Hank Paulson has got that look on his face. The gig is up. Now you know why President Bush got on TV in a vain attempt to change the old adage from the bigger they come, the harder they fall, to the 21st century newspeak of too big to fall. Followed by a $700 billion bank heist, which we now know is closer to $8 trillion, paid back at interest, of course, by us, the citizens of the United States. Now, how do you jam that down the throats of taxpayers? Well, that's the easy part.
The only way they can pass this bill is by creating and sustaining a panic atmosphere. That atmosphere is not justified. Many of us were told in private conversations that if we voted against this bill on Monday, that the sky would fall, the market would drop 2,000 or 3,000 points the first day, another couple thousand the second day, and a few members were even told that there would be martial law in America if we voted no. That's what I call fear-mongering.
Mr. Speaker, I have been thrown out of more meetings in this Capitol in the last 24 hours than I ever thought possible as a duly elected representative of 820,000 citizens of North Texas. Let's at least put this legislation up on the internet for 24 hours. That's what Thomas was made for. Let's do that and let the American people see what we have done in the dark of night. After all, I have not gotten any more mail, any more emails on any other subject than this one that is before us today. Mr. Speaker, I understand we're under martial law as declared by the Speaker last night.
And how about Alan Greenspan saying 2 weeks ago that basically the Federal Reserve is above the law?
What is the proper relationship, what should be the proper relationship between a chairman of the Fed and a president of the United States?
Well, first of all, the Federal Reserve is an independent agency, and that means basically that there is no other agency of government which can overrule actions that we take. So long as that is in place and there is no evidence that the administration or the Congress or anybody else is requesting that we do things other than what we think is the appropriate thing, then what the relationships are don't frankly matter.
They don't frankly matter. Well, here we are, ladies and gentlemen, 1 inch away. 1 inch away from what we all remember saying in high school. It can't happen here. Well, let me tell you, it can. And unless we do something about it, it will. And make no mistake about it, we're responsible, meaning we have the ability to respond. But at least now you know, when some right-wing pundit is telling you that this happened because black people bought houses, you're being lied to. When radio talk show hosts tell you that the reason we're in this mess is because pensions slaved for by auto workers, well, they're just too high, and that's the reason we can't compete. You're being lied to. This is debt slavery. This is insanity. So what do? Well, from the top down, we can start with our new President, Barack Obama, popularly elected 1 month ago today. And I know that not everyone here is a big fan, but he is our president, and the choice is not ours. The choice is his. Is he going to side with us, or is he going to side with the big banks? Time will tell, and he has options. He's the commander-in-chief, and when he gets sworn in, he will control the biggest, most expensive security apparatus in the world. And instead of turning that apparatus on us, he could and should turn it on those who have looted this country of everything she's worth. Quite frankly, it's a matter of national security. Of course, I don't think any of us expect him to follow the lead of Andrew Jackson and go get our assets back, but he could. And if he did, he would certainly have the support of the people. Secondly, he could pay it. As I described this situation to my 13-year-old daughter, that's exactly what she said. Why don't they just print the money and pay everybody? Normally, that might be a good idea. Goodness knows we've been bailing out businesses since the 60s, but it can't work this time. This is too much money. He could print his own money, like Lincoln, but it would cause hyperinflation to such a degree that your retirement fund of $1 million would barely be enough to buy a new car. That's not what you worked for. That's not what your parents worked their whole lives for. Imagine having $1 million of gold in the bank. Now that's store. But paper, bits on a computer screen, inflation, deflation, that's exactly what our forefathers warned us of. And their warnings are echoing. Third, he could just let it fail. And nobody gets paid. And some say that's what he should do. But he's not going to do that. And the reason he's not going to do that is because the magnitude of suffering caused by a complete breakdown of our financial system may actually lead to the necessity of martial law. What I think he'll try to do is deflate this bubble, make these people who are somehow owed billions take less, and slowly bring this thing through oversight, regulation, and additional taxes back into control. But that won't solve anything. We'll still have fake money based on debt. We'll still be alive, but we will not have an honest, sound money system. But what he can't do is convince us to scrap the system and start all over again with some sort of regional or world currency. For many years, there's been talk of creating a North American Union, a merger between Canada, Mexico, and the United States, sort of an EU, if you will, started by agreements such as NAFTA, GATT, and the like. Our currency would be the Amero, and there is some evidence to show it's already printed. That would be an absolute disaster. Cheap labor would flood up from the south, Canada would be looted of its raw materials, and we'll be left holding the bag. Our forefathers and mothers created this great country under the Constitution of the United States of America, for which millions have fought and died specifically because we're not Canada. We're not Mexico. And whoever thinks that our sovereignty would not be destroyed by getting rid of our precious dollar for a more competitive currency in a global market, well, then you haven't lived on this planet at any time during the last 400 years. The central banks are going to print the money of Europe. The central banks are going to print the money of Africa. The central banks are going to print the money of South America, who are on the doorstep of establishing their own South American Union. The central banks are going to print the money of Mexico, Belize, Costa Rica, and the rest of Central America. The central banks are going to print the money of Asia and Canada, but they don't have to print ours. And ladies and gentlemen, God help us if they ever dupe us into a one-world currency. If by whatever means the powers that be destroy the currencies of the world by some sort of globo or whatever they come up with, well, then we can honestly start talking about endgame. One world currency means one world government. And if that happens, then all of us are going to find out about the plans the global elite have for you and your family, as has been so thoroughly researched and documented by independent filmmaker Alex Jones. We are Americans, ladies and gentlemen, and that carries with it a certain responsibility. We are the only bastion of freedom, always have been. So the bottom line is we have options. Our president has options. I just don't think President Obama considers abolishing the Federal Reserve as one of them. But there is a movement afoot. From the right, we have presidential candidate, House of Representative Republican, Dr. Ron Paul.
Early on, the debate of money occurred during the convention. It was said that we could not emit bills of credit, which is paper money. It was also said that only gold and silver could be legal tender, and there was no authority for a central bank. Quickly thereafter, Hamilton established a national bank, and of course, Thomas Jefferson came along and got rid of it. And then, of course, the Second National Bank came along, and Andrew Jackson, another gold standard guy, got rid of that bank, too. So I can guarantee you, if I am to be your president, I will enjoy getting rid of the third national bank.
First reason is it's not authorized in the Constitution, so it's an illegal institution. And the second reason, it's an immoral institution because we have delivered to a secretive body the privilege of creating money out of thin air. If you or I did it, we'd be called counterfeiters, so why have we legalized counterfeiting? But the economic reasons are overwhelming. The Federal Reserve is the creature that destroys value. This station talks about free market capitalism, and you can't have free market capitalism if you have a secret bank creating money and credit out of thin air. They become the central planners. They decide what interest rates should be, what the supply of money should be.
Our message is very attractive to young people. They like the idea of self-reliance and individual liberty. They like to get out of these wars. They love the idea of talking about monetary policy, which neither McCain or Obama will dare talk about. Why do we have a Federal Reserve? And now that we have this financial crisis going on, the young people are really excited. Well, this is what we've been talking about not only for the past 2 years, for about many more years.
We're looking at a symptom. We're looking at the collapsing of a market that was unstable. It was unstable because of the way it came about. It came about because of a monopoly control of money and credit by the Federal Reserve System, and that is a natural consequence of what happens when a Federal Reserve System creates too much credit. Long term, this is disastrous because everything we're doing here, everything we've done for 6 months, we've already pumped in $700 billion. Here's another $700 billion. This is going to destroy the dollar. That's what you should be concerned about. Yeah, Wall Street's in trouble. There's a lot of problems. And if we don't vote for this, there's going to be problems. But believe me, if you destroy the dollar, you're going to destroy a worldwide economy, and that's what we're on the verge of doing.
And from the left, we have presidential candidate, House of Representative from Ohio, Democrat Dennis Kucinich.
It is absolutely astonishing that we're talking about giving $700 billion of taxpayers' money, which comes from the failure of the Fed, through a quadrupling of public and private debt during the time of Mr. Greenspan, up to $43 trillion. And we have no discussion at all about the underlying monetary policy. Isn't it time for fundamental change in our debt-based monetary system so we can free ourselves from the manipulation of by the Federal Reserve and the banks? Is this the United States Congress or the Board of Directors of Goldman Sachs? Because Washington needs to understand how we've been mired in debt and are staying there with the help of this fractional reserve banking. Washington needs to understand. Washington needs to understand that questions must be raised about why did we, in effect, give up our control of this asset, this ability to be able to issue money. Why did we give it to the Federal Reserve? We need to look at that again.
The Federal Reserve is not federal, and whatever they have in reserve doesn't belong to people. The Federal Reserve is there to service and protect the position of the banks. And the banks are in American life to make sure that the wealth of the nation accelerates upwards. The Fed, when it was created in 1913, actually the money creation power of the country was removed to private hands. This is something that most Americans don't have any clue about. Now, so the Federal Reserve, first of all, it needs to be held accountable within their sphere of activities now, because they played a role in looking the other way when the subprime loan scandal was burgeoning. They played a role in looking the other way, not regulating activity in hedge funds and the speculators on Wall Street. And they play a role in looking the other way with respect to the practices in the financial community, which essentially they've taken a laissez-faire approach. So, the Fed at least should be reformed, and at best there should be a repeal of the 1913 authorization, and we need to look at the money power issues in order to reclaim our democracy.
And from the financial markets, we have billionaire commodities broker Jim Rogers.
What would be the first two things you would do if you were in Mr. Bernanke's seat tomorrow morning?
I would abolish the Federal Reserve and I would resign. Step one is abolish the Fed, and step two is resign.
How would this help the 300 million Americans that you say aren't being helped out by the Fed's activities yesterday?
Then we don't have anybody printing money. We don't have inflation in the land. We don't have a collapsing U.S. dollar. We start to have a sound currency again, and we start to get rid of inflation. Inflation is not good for the world. No country in the world has ever succeeded by debasing its currency. That's what this man is trying to do. He's trying to debase the currency as a way to revive America. It has never worked in the long term or the medium term.
But Jim, absent of getting rid of the Federal Reserve, let's talk about real solutions here. What would you be doing instead of printing money? How do you get out of this credit crunch? How do you...
And of course, we have our biggest and most long-standing fan.
Making a good profit? Fair.
William Defoe. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a battle going on, and it is a battle for your freedom. And it has been raging for centuries. Now, what do? First and foremost, fight for internet freedom with our life breath. If the latest presidential election has shown anything, it has established beyond any reasonable doubt that we can be connected, we can get along, we can create coalitions, and our voice can be heard. Nobody reads the paper unless it's for sports or entertainment. Who wants to be lied to between column after column of advertisement? Most people still watch mainstream TV, but they do that as their entertainment. More and more people are getting onto alternative websites such as Huffington Post, Politico.com, Raw Story, Antiwar.com, Alternet, Infowars.com, and the list goes on. And it's fantastic. Some congressman makes a misstatement across the country, and in 3 hours, we're listening to it on the other side of the country, wireless on our laptop. But we can't take that for granted. The big corporations are already moving in and setting up shop, and they don't like competition. So when a teenager commits suicide in front of his computer while in a chat room, they're going to use that as grounds for regulation. It's happening all over the world to fight recruitment for Islamo-fascist groups, to aid in the containment of sexual predators who, believe me, are real and do exist, but cannot be used to restrict our freedoms. Because if they're not on the internet, they're going to be on the playground. And that's a fact. And I think most parents know that. And in fact, most children know that. And as far as adult material, well, the Supreme Court has already ruled repeatedly that content is protected by the First Amendment, which rightfully shifts the burden back to us to protect our children and exercise a little self-control ourselves. For goodness sakes, they sell programs at stores to filter that content. The bottom line is that without the internet, our mainstream media simply cannot be trusted to give us the information we need to survive. In fact, it's just the opposite, as now the media has become the cowardly lion used as a tool of propaganda. Secondly, email your congressman. And I know he or she is not going to email you back, that's for sure. Well, then write them a letter. Fax it to them. Call them. Go to their office. Whatever it takes. Increase the level of exchange of information. I'm looking around this audience tonight, and I'm seeing some people from Colorado We Are Change. These young men and women go out to representatives right on the street, video camera in hand. What's your monetary policy? And they post it up on the internet that night. Very polite. It's just amazing what these young freedom fighters get out of people. In my opinion, we must focus on the Congress, particularly the House of Representatives, is our forum, the people's forum. They're supposed to be there to represent us, but of course they don't. I live in the city and county of Denver, and the most conservative polls, as reported by Clear Channel radio stations, reported that 85% of the people in Denver did not want the bailout. But our representative not only ignored the will of her constituents, but even after the House rejected the bailout on Monday, she spent the entire week rallying votes to pass a bill that we knew was wrong. And of course, a month later, she won re-election for the 8th time in a row. But I suspect 2 years, her opposition is going to be a little stronger. Here's just a taste of what's going on in the House of Representatives now.
Mr. Kashkari, in the neighborhood I grew up in the inner city of Baltimore, one of the things that you tried to do was make sure that you were not considered a chump. And what chump meant was that you didn't want people to see you as just somebody they could get over on. And I'm just wondering how you feel about an AIG giving $503 million worth of bonuses out of one hand and accepting $154 billion from hard-working taxpayers. Because I'm trying to make sure you get it. I mean, and you know what really bothers me is because all these other people who are lined up, they say, well, is Kashkari a chump?
We've been told, such as credit default swaps and collateralized debt obligations that have to be covered. Well, let's be honest with one another. If that's what we're going to be doing, then let's tell the American people and let's get it done the right way. We understand in this $870 billion that they want us to take from the taxpayers, that over half of that money will go to foreign creditors. Doesn't this Congress and don't the American people have a right to know to whom? And how much? And what does this all mean? And how did we get in this situation? Because if we really don't understand what we're getting into, we can't get out of it. And if only a few people know, and this is an inside trade inside of Washington, and the American people don't understand it, and we don't do this together as a people, then how are we really going to make it better?
Lastly, ladies and gentlemen, let me ask you not to be scared. I know people say that's how the elite want you to feel, and it's true. But the simple fact is, fear's not going to do us one bit of good. There is nothing to fear, including fear itself. And if you don't think the elite are going to use fear as we approach the change of age in 2012, you've got another thing coming. Remember Y2K? They're masters at scaring us. Google search Michael Tessarian and watch his 2012 The Future of Mankind, and listen to that very intelligent man tell you that nothing is going to happen to us except maybe a change in consciousness. This doesn't have to be the age of Armageddon. This is going to be the age of revelation, during which many will be revealed. And I know no one wants to suffer. I realize no one wants to lose their investments. No one wants to lose their house or their life. That's obvious. But we have to be strong. Our children are watching us. They need us. We have to stay positive. And although we realize what is at stake, we ultimately know what real quality of life is truly about. It's watching our kids play soccer, reading a book, snuggling up on the couch with your sweetheart watching a movie, playing guitar, listening to music, worshiping, throwing a pot, planting a tree, painting a picture, working out, volunteering, eating, daydreaming, traveling, writing a poem, getting together with family and friends on a holiday. That's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And I know all that stuff costs money, but how much? Quadrillions? And as far as the global elite and the big bankers that truly got us into this horrible crisis, convincing us that greed is good, well, God bless them too, as most of them are lost souls who just don't know how to love. Some are evil, some deserve to go to prison, but you know what? There's always going to be elite. There'll always be those who spend every waking hour making money and gaining power. There'll always be those born into wealth thinking they're better than everybody. There'll always be those who run big corporations, own football teams, fly in private jets, wear $5,000 suits, and have underground bunkers in Peru. That's fine. They play their part. Just don't let them print your money. Don't let them print your money. In closing, let me say this. I thought long and hard about including the clip of Jesus overturning the tables of the money changers because I did not want to include a religious reference in my argument. But I thought it was metaphorically important because, you see, after Jesus chased the money changers from the temple, the money changers went to the king, from whom we declared our independence and built a system with institutions to protect our freedoms. Then the money changers descended on the halls of justice. And so now it's on us. What are we going to do? What am I going to do? What are you going to do? Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you do nothing else, just changing your consciousness about this thing we call money, just changing your consciousness on this issue will have more of an impact than you can ever imagine. Thank you very much. God bless you. Drive safely. Thank you. Thank you.